So today we're going to make creamed chipped beef on toast, sometimes called SOS, sometimes called shit on a shingle. It's an absolutely delicious basic dish in which you really have very, very simple components. Just essentially a cream gravy that is essentially just a roux mixed with milk with very few other seasonings, and you have the beef itself. It admits of many variations. You know, you can do whatever you like. I often add peas and that sort of thing to it, but its original form is just the cream gravy with the beef. All right, let's get started. So the pan's heating up here. I'm going to make enough for 2 people, and so that's 2 cups of milk plus any other bit of a liquid that I add. For 2 cups of milk, I need 2 tablespoons of butter for each cup and 2 tablespoons of flour for each cup. Now, as I've talked about before, it's important that you spend enough time incorporating the fat into the flour. And that's just because every grain of flour needs to have a coating of fat. That's how it doesn't clump up when you add the liquid. The nice part about that is that if you spend enough time making sure that the flour is evenly coated with the fat, what you get is also the raw taste cooked out of the flour. Now, it's important in this dish to not have a particularly high heat in the pan, because you're not looking for a brown gravy. You're looking actually for a very, very pale gravy. So one of the things you want to do is you want to cook out that flour taste without overly browning either the butter or the flour itself. Remember, the milk solids in the butter will brown, and so will the flour itself. So let's just spend another, so really generally speaking, 2 minutes of cooking and stirring is perfect to remove the raw taste from the flour and to make sure that it's completely, that the flour granules are completely coated with butter. By the way, as I've mentioned before, I always add a little bit extra flour, typically anywhere from a half a tablespoon to a tablespoon, and that's because I would rather the gravy in the final version come out a little too thick than too thin. If it comes out too thick, it's a simple matter to thin it. If it comes out too thin, all you can really do at that point is evaporate off some of the moisture. Essentially just sit there and let it simmer. And that you might not have the time for that. Okay, so what you can see is that, you know, the pan is certainly hot enough. There's certainly no sticking on the bottom of this pan at all, which is good. But I'm keeping the heat nice and low. And the flour is definitely cooking in that hot oil. It feels like a long time, but it's worth it if you don't want that taste of raw flour, and you want to make the gravy nice and smooth. So speaking of making the gravy smooth, it's time to add milk. Oops. For some reason I can never do it perfectly. So I'm going to add a little bit of it. I'm going to, because the milk is on the cold side of room temperature, I'm going to turn up the heat a little bit. Not much, but just enough to make sure I don't have to take forever to heat the milk up. And you can see now that the heat's taken effect because it's thickening right up. At which point I'll add another bit of the milk. I typically add about 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. And I will say one other thing. You'll see a million strategies for getting a smooth gravy. Those strategies, that people talk about the temperature of the milk and how fast you add it. I have seen many people swear by adding cold milk to gravy ensures no lumps and that sort of thing. I have found that there is no better predictor than whether your gravy will be smooth than whether or not you've taken the time to incorporate the fat and the flour. Generally speaking, when I see lumpy gravies, one of two things have happened. Either they didn't take enough time to incorporate the fat and the flour, or they didn't do what I'm doing now. They didn't take enough time to stir it. Now you can see that there are lumps in this gravy. And the reason there are lumps is because there are basically lumps of fatty flour. And as the gravy heats up, that fat is going to melt. It's going to thin out and it's going to distribute itself through the gravy. But the only way it's going to distribute itself, I guess I shouldn't say it's going to distribute itself, because you're going to distribute it for it through what I'm doing right now. There is really no shortcut around just a couple of minutes of stirring. This. Now, while I'm finishing that, I'm going to talk a little bit about this, which is the chipped beef itself. So this is regular Armour dried beef. I hope that shows up okay. I use, for two people, I use the 2.25 ounce container. I then cut it up into strips. And at that point, what I'm doing is I'm doing sort of the other truly critical step of this dish, which is I'm removing as much of the salt as I can. So chipped beef has an absolutely staggering amount of salt. That's just a holdover from when there was no other good method of preservation. And as a result, it's unbelievably salty. But that salt was never meant to just be eaten straight. Whether you're talking about salt pork or dried chipped beef, all of those, the original recipes, and by the way, I'm sure you can see right now how unbelievably smooth and creamy this is. So all of those recipes assumed that the meat would be soaked in water beforehand. Interestingly, the original Army Field Manual for Spam that used Spam in different Army dishes, it also instructed you to cut up or slice the Spam and then soak it in warm water for a little while prior to using it. So what I've got here is you take the beef, you slice it up, and then you put it in a bowl with some warm water. And then I always just, after swishing it around, I just pour off the water and then I refill it. And now, by the way, I'm going to switch to a spoon because otherwise these shreds of beef will get caught up in the whisk. And I don't need the whisk anymore because the gravy, you can see, is just gorgeously smooth. So basically, I've rinsed the beef twice. First, sort of rinsing it immediately after I cut it, and then allowing it to soak in fresh, warm water until I'm ready to use it. The idea is just to remove as much salt, and that's really the only way that you're going to get control over the amount of salt in the finished dish. So now, what I can see here is that this gravy, and I'm going to taste it. This gravy, of course, at this point, it needs salt because I've removed so much of the salt from the chipped beef. but also it's a little thick. And that's because of that little bit of extra flour I added. And so at this point, I'm just going to thin it. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use cream because I want it to be nice and creamy. But you could just throw in some additional milk at that point. You could even throw in water. It's all good. So now I just want to fully incorporate this and see the consistency. If it's not thinning enough for my taste, I'll add a little bit more liquid. Sometimes, depends. For two people, I've already added now I don't know, I probably added about a quarter cup of cream, maybe a little bit less than that, still a little bit thick. So I'm going to switch over to milk. And it's very important that you add all of these non-salted liquids before you figure out the seasoning of the dish. So that's basically right there is just perfect. So there's still some salt left in the meat, of course, but not a ton. And it's through osmosis right now. It's basically slowly seasoning the gravy. I'm going to taste it. It's excellent. Excellent. However, of course, it does need a lot of salt. So at this point, I've got a decision to make. What I'm going to do is add just regular kosher salt. And I'm going to start with a quarter teaspoon. While that's dissolving, I'm going to add the other pretty crucial ingredient, black pepper. Basically, white pepper, or white gravy, I don't ever think it tastes normal without black pepper, which just complements it perfectly. If by any chance you don't like the speckles, which actually I think are kind of nice looking, if you don't like the speckles, you can put white pepper in. White pepper has a slightly different taste, but it achieves much of the same result. It's not quite as resinous tasting. It's a little more floral tasting. Okay, that's pretty darn good. It needs a hair more salt. I put in, that's a little less than a quarter of a teaspoon. And I'll taste it just before I serve it. And the reason why I'm not going to add any more is because the salt's got to balance. If there's any excess salt in the meat, it's got to move out into the gravy and so forth. So what I'm going to do is I'll basically just cover this. And I will tell you that allowing your gravy just to simmer for a few minutes is a very important step, in my opinion, in balancing the flavors and allowing them to marry together. And so that's okay, because when you need it to simmer for a few minutes, you still have to, make whatever you're going to serve the gravy over and plate it. So in this case, I'm going to use a classic, which is Texas toast. So I'm going to cover this, let it simmer over my smallest burner, really just to keep it warm. And then I'll cook up some Texas toast and plate it. I'll give you a snapshot of the way it looks at the end so you can see the final product. Anyway, that's creamed chipped beef on toast. Thanks for watching.